The doomed city may seem an odd place to start with the Strugatsky brothers, but there's method to my madness. While the Strugatskys were the top tier of critically acclaimed writers of Soviet science fiction, Doomed City is not one of those acclaimed books. At least, not at the time. They didn't even try to publish it, knowing that it wouldn't get past the censors. Their optimism about the bright communist future had, by that point, turned into a scathing satirical take on the Soviet system. So the setting. The city is a closed society, swamps to the south, a towering impenetrable wall to the east, a bottomless abyss to the west. North, well, we'll get to the north in due time. The sun is an artificial thing, on during the day and turned off at night. And the city is the site of an experiment. The experiment. What exactly it is or is meant to prove is unknown. The experiment is the experiment, as the city's residents say. All the inhabitants of the city are pulled from different times, though within a few decades of each other. Germans from the 40s, Russians from the 50s, Swedes from the 60s, for example, all living together and able to communicate as though speaking the same language. Sort of a Babelfish thing happening. We begin with Andrei Voronin, formerly an astronomer in the Soviet Union and now a garbage collector in the city. He and the rest of his crew, including Izya Katzman, a Russian Jew, and Fritz Heiger, a Wehrmacht NCO, are accosted while collecting the trash from a complex where Wang, a Chinese peasant, serves as caretaker. The attackers are a troop of trash-flinging baboons, which proceed further into the city and plague it with vagrancy, panhandling, and hooliganism. There is, of course, much deliberating about how to deal with this monkey problem. Some want to send the police out to shoot them, but the police no longer carry guns because criminals were attacking them to steal the weapons. After much debate, the city administration finds a solution. Have you heard? The Council of District Commissioners is considering a draft resolution. He lifted one finger in the air and raised his voice. Concerning the regularization of the situation that has arisen in connection with the presence within the city limits of large aggregations of dog-headed monkeys. It is proposed to register all the monkeys, fit them with metal collars and discs bearing their names, and then assign them to institutions and private individuals who will be responsible for them henceforth. He started giggling, then grunting, and then began hammering his right fist into the open palm of his left hand with shrill, lingering little groans. Superb! All other work has been abandoned. All the factories are producing collars and name discs. Our Mr. Mayor is personally taking into his care 3 mature baboons and is calling on the public to follow his example. Will you take a female baboon, Andre? Selma will be against it, but such is the requirement of the experiment. And as everyone knows, the experiment is the experiment. And throughout the story, the baboons are just normalized. The problem was solved by just accepting it, bureaucratizing it, and declaring it not a problem. Perhaps the most Brezhnev thing ever. And Andrei has a particular perspective on the city, working as a garbage collector, disposing of its refuse and keeping things tidy. But the residents rotate through jobs. A similar idea was presented in Bogdanov's Red Star, discussed in another video, but this time it's not voluntary. New jobs are assigned. So Andrei becomes a police investigator. Some might say that's kind of the same job, but it gives him a very different perspective. He has several cases, some of them quite baffling. For example, the Red Building, which appears seemingly at random throughout the city, and those who enter are never seen again. And the Falling Stars case, bodies that were found having fallen from a great height near the unscalable wall. But there are also some very simple cases. Wang, still a caretaker, has been arrested. What do you mean arrested? What for? Sabotage, Wang said in a quiet voice. What sabotage? Andrei exclaimed, dumbfounded. Avoidance of the right to work. See, it came time for reassignment, and they wanted to make Wang the supervisor of a shoe factory. But he didn't want to be a supervisor. He wants to stay a caretaker, maintain the grounds, take out the trash. He's content where he is. But the law requires that he accept a position with more authority and responsibility, a more desirable job. Only it's not more desirable to him. Bringing me to my first little aside here. Facts and theory. Not fact versus theory, because they're kind of equal parts. So, some facts about our society. There are poor people. There are rich people. Rich people have more influence. Crime happens. It would be hard to dispute any of those points. But how we connect the points determines how we think about them. So we could say that the rich people are rich because they steal the value of labor from the poor, and crime is a result of this material injustice. Now we have a neat little Marxist class struggle box that we can put everything into. But there are other equally valid ways to connect the dots. Most of the time, people equate the facts and their particular way of connecting them. Most political arguments are about the lines, not the dots. We think our opponents are ignoring the facts when they're just seeing different relationships between them. And so there's a lot of confusion about Wang's refusal to be promoted. Well, I think it will be hard for you to understand, Wang said thoughtfully. What is there to understand? Andre asked impatiently. It's obvious that it's better to be a director of an industrial plant than to spend your whole life raking up trash, or even worse, to slave away in the swamps for 6 months. Wang shook his head. No, it isn't better, he said. The best place of all to be is one from which you can't fall. You can't understand that, Andre. They have different priorities, different value systems. Wang is sick of the rat race. Andre wants to help his friend, and they both know the director of the labor exchange. So Andre makes a call and gets it arranged so that Wang can remain a caretaker for as long as he wants. No one else wants the job, Wang's happy, it's a win all around. But Andre's view on the matter is disputed by his friend Kenzie. The law on the right to diversified labor, the law, Andre broke in, was devised for the good of the experiment, not to harm it. A law can't anticipate everything. We enforcers of the law have to know how to think for ourselves. My view on the enforcement of the law is somewhat different, Kenzie said dryly. In any case, you don't decide such matters. The court does. The court would have shipped him off to the swamps, said Andre. He has a wife and a child. Duralex sed lex, said Kenzie. That adage was invented by bureaucrats. That adage, Kenzie said gravely, was invented by people who wish to preserve a unified legal basis for the social coexistence of a disparate mass of free human beings. But back to his case, the one that he was actually assigned. A mysterious building that appears at seemingly random places in the city, swallows anyone that enters it, then disappears. For a while, he thinks it's some strange urban legend, especially after some of the alleged witnesses turn out to be just repeating rumors they heard. Until he goes inside the building for himself, which only presents more questions, at least some of which he thinks Izya can answer. He was there. He had a file that he claimed came from inside the building, but he managed to dispose of it before he was brought into the police station, where he then denies everything. Andre finds it to be an infuriating interrogation, so he calls in someone more experienced at extracting information. Fritz Heiger. Guys, he said in a choking voice. Guys, wait. If anything comes up, we'll be in the basement, Fritz purred in velvet tones, smiled at Andre, and prodded Izya out into the corridor. There's some parallels here with the Stanford prison experiment. These guys were all friends when they were on garbage detail, but now that they're separated by social distinctions, in this case, policeman and suspect, they'll do horrific things to each other as though acting out the roles. But that's not where this is really going. Everyone in the city was recruited and periodically visited by a mentor. That was it. He had to wait, summon up his patience and wait. Then everything would be justified. The nauseous feeling would pass off and he'd be able to breathe a sigh of relief. Yes, Andre, sometimes one even has to resort to this, he heard a familiar, calm voice say. Sitting on the stool where Izya had been sitting only a minute ago, with one leg crossed over the other and his slim white fingers clasped on his knee, gazing at Andre with a sad, weary expression, was the mentor. He was nodding gently, and the corners of his mouth were dolefully turned down. For the sake of the experiment? Andre asked hoarsely. For the sake of the experiment as well, said the mentor. But above all, for one's own sake. There was no way around it. You had to go through this too. We don't want just any kind of people. We need a special kind of people. What kind? That's something even we don't know, the mentor said with quiet regret. There's a lot to unravel here, and at this point we don't have all the rope. Why is resorting to brutality sometimes necessary? In the sense not of a means to an end, but an experience one must have. And what kind of experiment is it when even those conducting it have no idea what they're looking for? Without a hypothesis, it's not really an experiment, it's just doing shit. which is reflective of the time. The Soviet experiment was starting to look that way. Khrushchev's bold 1961 claim that the transition to true communism would be underway by 1980 had faded into a stagnation that, if you stared at it long enough, looked like a slow and inexorable decline. But back to Andrei and his investigation. He takes the opportunity to ask about the Red Building. Have you not sensed already that the Red Building is a necessity? Are you really the same as you were this morning? Katzman said the Red Building is the delirious raving of an agitated conscience. Well now, Katzman is smart. I hope you wouldn't argue with that. Of course not, said Andrei. That's precisely why he's dangerous. Once again, the mentor showed Andrei yes with just his eyes. Andrei doesn't fully crack that case, and in time he's assigned to a new job, this time as editor of one of the city's newspapers. Of course, it's a Soviet-style paper with a chief censor on staff to quash stories. Andrei walks the line to get away with as much as he can, and the paper has a lot of stories to cover. Unrest, shortages, and the sun has been turned off for weeks. But nothing flips what is and isn't acceptable to print like a sudden regime change. Where did you disappear to? I've been searching for you everywhere. What are we going to do? There's a fascist coup in the city. Why fascist? Andrei asks, stunned. Because it's Fritz Heiger leading it. And yet, the slogans being shouted could work for a wide range of ideological boxes, albeit all of them of the totalitarian inclination. In the name of the people, I shall not permit the slightest discord. No more struggle between people. No more communists, no more socialists, no more capitalists, no more fascists. No more fighting against each other. We shall fight for each other. On and on, it's all rather unpleasant, but in equal measure to how unsatisfactory the prior arrangement was. A new day dawning and all that. And then the sun comes back on. The new regime puts an end to this constant job-swapping stuff, solves the baboon problem with finality, raises an army, and presumably makes the trains run on time, too. But we have to wonder, is this all just part of the experiment? But the sun, said Andrei. Why did you switch it off? The mentor clasped his hands together and strode backward and forward across the hallway. But we didn't switch it off, he said sorrowfully. An accident, totally and absolutely unplanned. No one was expecting it. Run out of control, Andrei repeated again. I never thought the experiment could run out of control. The mentor cast a sullen glance at him. Well now, that is, in a manner of speaking. We could also look at it this way. If the experiment has run out of control, it is still the experiment. Possibly something will have to be modified somewhat, recalibrated, and so in retrospect, this Egyptian night will come to be regarded as an integral programmed part of the experiment. Once again, redefining a failure into a necessary part of the plan. A little recalibration. Time for another one of those asides. On that theme of the winter of Soviet socialism, what might socialism look like today if it were based on the ideas of, say, Fourier, Owen, or Proudhon rather than Marx? There were several strains of socialist thought before Marx, Engels, and several other writers in that tradition dominated it and proceeded to define rivals out of the club. What we have now is Marxists defining socialism in specifically Marxist terms, and in so doing, excluding related but competing ideas away. For example, bourgeois sellouts in the case of Social Democrats. More controversially, tools of the capitalist class in the case of fascism, etc. And while that Marxist class struggle model can be a useful analytical tool in some cases, it's not the only class-based model we have. For example, if we look back to feudal systems, we have the nobility, the priesthood, merchants, and warriors as distinct classes with their own class interests. But they're not always either-or distinctions. Many second or third sons of nobles went into the priesthood, but retained those familial ties and the influence that came with them. Class boundaries can be fluid to some extent. And this older form is still with us today alongside the Marxist class model. While the religious priesthood is much less influenced today, that role is filled by a secular equivalent of lawyers and functionaries, a priesthood of the state, which Incidentally, is one of the failure points with socialist governments based on Marxist ideas. Even if someone starts as a worker, when you put them in charge of some government function, as we will soon see with Andre, they quickly become part of that state managerial class that has its own interests that only partially align with the workers. And workers often have competing interests, not all of them economic, which the oversimplified Marxist conception of class consciousness frequently misses. Marxism is kind of like a subway map. It's great for navigating a specific aspect of your surroundings, but it's simplified, stylized, and doesn't reflect the actual distance or relative positions of its key points. Keep it in your pocket for those times you use the metro, but it's not going to help you drive out of the city. So back to it. Andre is offered a new job as the new regime settles in. Fritz elevates him to the highest levels of government. It doesn't take long for Andre, an enthusiastic member of the Communist Party in his old life, once a garbage collector in this one, to get comfortable with this new arrangement. Andre suddenly got an unfamiliar, exciting feeling. Suddenly he was very clearly aware that here he was, a counselor, an important member of the president's personal chancellery, and a highly respected man, who had a wife, a beautiful wife, and a gracious home. And here was his wife about to go to the hair salon because in the evening they would be receiving guests, and the guests would be not just anybody, but all respectable and important people. The right kind of people, the best in the city. He not only has the official duties of his post, heading the personal chancellery of the President for Science and Technology, but also the political functions. Whether run by mentors or some Nazi, there are eyes and ears everywhere. Andre has to sign off on dismissals, removals, and other consequences for those in his department who say impolitic things. Sullivan claims that the experiment on the city is still going on. According to him, the glass house is continuing the line of the experiment regardless of its own intentions. He claims that the turning point is only one stage of the experiment. Hallowed words, thought Andre. Izya says the same thing, and Fritz doesn't like it at all. Only Izya is allowed to say it, and the unfortunate Sullivan isn't. And while Andre doesn't like this part of his new position, he falls into it readily enough. Once a devoted and idealistic communist, he easily shifts into a cog in an authoritarian machine ruled by a technocratic elite that isn't above using threats and violence to keep the rabble in line. And this isn't just me sifting for anti-communist implications. This is authorial intent. In the afterword of this English edition, Boris Strugatsky asks us to consider the central character himself, Andrei Voronin, a Komsomol, Leninist-Stalinist, a thoroughgoing communist true believer, a champion of the happiness of the common people, who evolves with such spontaneous ease into a top-ranking bureaucrat, a smooth, lordly, self-indulgent, petty chieftain and arbiter of human destiny. And what about the instinctive ease with which this Komsomol Stalinist becomes first the good friend and then the comrade-in-arms of an inveterate Hitlerite Nazi? And how much these apparent ideological antagonists turn out to have in common. The Doomed City is a rather dense story, and there's a lot that I'm just not getting into here because I want to focus on the big thing going forward. Fritz wants to send an expedition, partly in search of resources, but also to scout out the potential enemy he's convinced is out there. The Anti-City, presumably hostile with its agents already working at nefarious ends within the city itself. And so Andre, Izya, and their team of soldiers and scientists head north. They find some other people, some of them quite sensible, and others less so. And ruins, long dead bodies within the ruins. They encounter many strange things, walking statues, things which I'll not give a full accounting of here. It's as if the city began somewhere in the north and has been growing southward, leaving its own dead husk behind it as it goes. Like it's molting. Time gets a little wonky for Izya and Andre while they investigate a library and the rest of the expedition doesn't make it. And so they're out in the wilderness with no food, no water, essentially waiting to die. And here the mentor returns for another chat. I've already had ideas. All sorts of hooey about the good of society and other mumbo-jumbo for kids still wet behind the ears. I've already made a career. Thanks, I've had enough of being a big boss, so what else is there that can happen to me? Understanding, said the mentor, slightly raising his voice. What understanding? Understanding of what? Understanding, the mentor repeated. That's what you've never had before. Understanding. The final section of the Doomed City poses many questions and answers precious few of them. It's that kind of book, driving you to think things apart and look back for clues. And on that note of understanding, Izya shares his thoughts, shaped around a metaphor of a temple. They talk of high culture, of great men and heroes, of the whole wisdom and experience of mankind, much to Andrei's annoyance. I don't understand any of this, said Andrei. Your explanation is too confused. Some kind of religion, temple, spirit. Well, of course, said Izya. Since it's not a bottle of vodka and it's not a twin mattress, it's got to be religion. What are you getting bristly about? You're the one who's been nagging me about how you've lost the ground under your feet and you're suspended in empty space. And that's right, you are. That's what had to happen to you. It happens to any man who thinks even the tiniest little bit. And it's not only Andrei who's lost the ground under his feet. It's the authors as well. Again, from Boris Strugatsky's Afterward. The primary goal of our novel was not clear from the very beginning, but gradually assumed the following form. To demonstrate how, under the pressure of the circumstances of life, a young man's worldview radically changes, how he shifts from the position of an unshakable fanatic to the condition of a man suspended, as it were, in an airless ideological void, without even the slightest purchase for his feet. A life trajectory very familiar to the authors, and one which we consider not merely dramatic, but also instructive. After all, an entire generation traveled this path over the period from 1940 to 1985. And so, rather than recounting a chronology of events at the end of the story and offering my 2 or 3 interpretations of what it could mean, I'm going to instead run with this idea of ideology failing, of losing one's religion, as it were. The Strugatskys' collective body of work can be read as a sort of spiritual history of the Soviet Union, from optimism and faith in the great mission to stagnation, disillusion, and ultimately collapse. They live through it, and we can see the shift happening in real time through their work. The world became less knowable and more capricious, and by the Doomed City, well, the ground had fallen away. That life experience of these 2 men living through the Soviet experiment can't be separated from their work. It's the story of their lives. And on a similar note, it should be borne in mind that as insightful as Marxist analysis can be at times, it can never fully escape being, at least in part, the self-serving justification of the deadbeat mooch that came up with it.